Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about the male and female gaze as applied to film theory. So as an outline of my talking points, we will be discussing the research question. This will then be followed by an overview of the materials, how my sources address the research question, and some conclusions that I have found. So starting off with the research question, is there such a thing as the female gaze in film theory? And if so, how does this compare to the concept of the male gaze? The male gaze is a point of view in literary and digital media, and it's from the viewing pleasure and perspective of hetero men. And this form of content is predominantly characterized by the objectification of women. The female gaze is meant to oppose this in cinema, but there are many controversies pertaining to this within the film discourse community. Many film theorists debate whether or not the female gaze exists, while others argue that even with its existence, the male gaze can never truly be reversed. So I've created a synthesis map over here that addresses all of the points of commonalities between the articles that were used for this project. So the points are all color-coded as indicated on the chart, and as an overall consensus through all these sources, the male gaze is strongly viewed as a negative. And this is one of the reasons why almost all of these sources have points regarding sexualization and objectification, which are the most commonly associated attributes of the male gaze. So now let's move on to a more in-depth review of the materials. So the first source is a research article, and what the source talks about is how, unlike the male gaze, the focus of the female gaze is shifted away from the sexualization of women to the representation of women as more than objects. So the author states an opinion that is actually quite controversial because she implies that the female gaze is directly combative with the male gaze and that it is in some ways a solution to the male gaze. So this is directly argued by our second source. Many theorists consider the female gaze to be the exact opposite of the male gaze, but according to this author, the female gaze cannot simply be denoted by a female perspective because women are also capable of producing sexist media. And for this reason, the author suggests that the female gaze does not yet exist. And this is because feminist film media is narrowly scoped to the experiences and perspectives of white women. And the author further implies that film media needs to address film and feminism's historical bias towards white women and their stories, as well as how these stories have overshadowed the experiences of women of color and other minority groups. So from these two sources, we're able to address the first part of our research question with varying opinions on whether or not the female gaze exists in film theory. So from our next source, we're able to delve into the second part of our research question. And the function of this essay is to discuss and argue how the male gaze advocates and supports passive, masochistic female spectatorship through film. So the encouragement of the male gaze is not only the fault of the patriarchy, but what this article explains is that women have allowed themselves to maintain a passive role and thus force themselves to submit to the male gaze, allowing it to live on. So from our next two sources, we are able to further compare the role of objectification and dominance when it comes to the two gendered gazes. So this first source explains how the male gaze promotes the objectification of women to ascertain dominance. And although many argue that the film industry has progressed in the sense that it no longer puts women into these overtly sexualized passive roles, this New York Film Academy study, whose infographic that I have put on the slides, is just a piece of research that suggests otherwise. So this next source explains that the male gaze ascertains dominance through the objectification of women, but that the female gaze does not rely on this the way that the male gaze does. The female gaze actually does not seek to establish dominance at all. So where the male gaze is all about what men see and how people are perceived, the female gaze is all about what people feel and what they experience. So with this final source, it's simply an analysis on what the female gaze is. So this author describes it as the way that women are portrayed from the perspective of women rather than men. And from this point of view, women are seen as people with thoughts and feelings rather than objects. And the focus is pulled away from what the eyes can see and instead to what a person is feeling. So are there any limitations or problems or gaps with the research? So a limitation presented by this research topic is that there is not much scholarly material out there to be used. The female gaze is a relatively new concept, which in itself limits the amount of material. Furthermore, the film discourse community is one that primarily shares their content through informal means, such as video sharing platforms and blogs, which makes it harder to identify what sources are credible for research. Now, here's some conclusions that I've come to based on the research. So when it comes to whether or not the female gaze exists, I would conclude that there is a version of the female gaze that predominantly caters to the experience and feelings of hetero white women. And in order for the female gaze to reach a place where it is not harmful the way that the male gaze is, the feminist film community must open itself to portraying the experiences of women of minority communities as well. As to how the female gaze pertains to the male gaze is dependent on women remaining in a submissive, overtly sexualized role. And these roles are harmful and innately damaging to how society perceives women, not as people, but as objects. So the female gaze has the ability to counter this, not by flipping roles and objectifying men, but by telling its stories through how the character feels rather than what the character sees. I'd like to thank you all for your time. This is my work cited. Again, thank you and have a good day.